Now, to closer to home, Australia's been doing incredibly well on COVID-19, and much of the Pacific has been as well. But unfortunately, cases have surged in recent days in Papua New Guinea, prompting calls to fast-track vaccine access there. Let's get some analysis on where the Pacific is at, our neighbours in the region. Joining me is Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU, Professor Stephen Howes, an expert in the Pacific and in development. Professor Howes, thanks very much for your time. What is the situation as you look across the Pacific? Few concerns in PNG, but much of the region untouched.
That's right. Overall, the Pacific has done well on COVID-19 and pretty much kept it out. But just over the last month, and I'd say just the last week, things have become really concerning in Papua New Guinea. The numbers tested positive, still only about 1,600, but we know there's massive under-testing. So there are clear signs of community transmission. And I think what's also worrying, it seems to have taken hold in the hospital. There was one report that some 40% of pregnant women in the labour ward tested positive for COVID-19. So that's clear evidence it is circulating around Port Morsley's main hospital. And obviously that's, got to be a major source of concern for the country. It's mainly in Port Moresby, but it's not only in the capital. We do see other areas of COVID-19 around PNG. The other country I'd mention is Timor-Leste. That's, on the edge of the Pacific, but another small island state, again, done very well, but just recently seems to have got community transmission. Of course, it's right next to Indonesia. Indonesia's had real problems with COVID-19. So Timor-Leste has announced a lockdown for its capital city. So obviously it's very concerned.
Professor Howes, our government has committed to playing a big part in terms of getting vaccines out to the nations of the Pacific. Obviously, top of that list right now must be those two nations you referred to, particularly PNG.
Yeah, that's right. I think, there was a certain complacency that had crept in. And, as part of that, probably quarantine procedures weren't being followed strictly. And that's probably what's allowed the virus now to get out of control. But also I'd say, there was a pretty sort of relaxed attitude to the vaccine. And in fact, there were quite a few views, do we need the vaccine? We're not actually vulnerable to COVID-19. But yeah, that's all really changed very quickly over the last week. And obviously now Papua New Guinea is sort of really desperate to get that vaccine as soon as possible. And obviously it's in Australia's interest as well to get the vaccine there. So yeah, I think that's moved from being a pretty low priority to really being the top priority.
Yeah, understandably. When you look at the region, we spoke about the health impact. It's certainly a number of nations untouched, thankfully. But the economic impact's been devastating, hasn't it? How important is it that we start to open up travel to the region again, and as soon as possible?
Yeah, that's right. Even in countries that haven't really been touched by COVID-19 in a health sense, have still really suffered economically. So Fiji is a good example because Fiji is so dependent on tourism, and tourism's ground to a halt. There is a success story there because we have Australia and New Zealand have managed to sort of resurrect their seasonal worker programs, which bring in workers from the Pacific, and that ground to a halt, but has now has been started up again, with the appropriate quarantine and testing arrangements. So that's a real positive for the economy. But yeah, the next step is to get tourism back. There's been a lot of talk about a Pacific bubble, but we've seen how difficult it's been just to get that bubble going between Australia and New Zealand. And in terms of tourism, hasn't started up yet. But with the vaccine coming, both in Australia and a number of Pacific countries do already have the vaccine, there is hope that we can get tourism up and running, and that's got to be a priority. It's not easy for these countries. One, very telling statistic is that in Australia we've increased our government spending by 40% to respond to COVID. Very justified. But in the countries like Fiji and PNG, there's been no increase in expenditure. No, none at all. They just don't have that same access to low-cost, easy borrowing that we do. So, yeah, economically, they're in a really tight spot. They can't afford to lock down domestically. We have to help them to reopen to the world. And with the vaccine coming, I think that is a realistic prospect.
And on to a final topic. It's a story that I think a lot of our viewers wouldn't be aware of, but it is important for the stability of the Pacific and our region. 5 Micronesian countries threatening to quit the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, these aren't big nations, but they're strategically very important nations to Australia. Should our government, or what should our government do to salvage this, to keep those 5 countries, including Kiribati, the Federated States of Micronesia, to keep them in the tent, basically?
Yeah, that's right. Last month, there was this unfortunate split in what's called the Pacific Island Forum, which is the regional body that brings all the Pacific Islands together. There was a dispute over who should be the leader. And because these 5 countries didn't get their candidate up, even though, they really had signalled that it was their turn, they said they're going to quit. And 3 of them, have pretty much, I think they are definitely quitting. The other 2, Nauru and Kiribati, says it's not so clear whether they actually will follow through on that threat. But it is very damaging for the Pacific Island Forum. In terms of what Australia can do, I mean, I think it's too late. I think if we wanted to stop this dispute happening, we needed to have been much more proactive in the run-up to the vote and prevent this disagreement over who should be the leader, sort of prevent it from just rolling and rolling and rolling and then eventually crashing into a brick wall. I don't think there's much we could do in the short run. I mean, in the longer term, I think everyone recognises, such a fragile region with small countries, they do need to all come together. So I'm sure the Pacific Island Forum will rebuild, but in the short term, the damage has been done, and it's going to take time.
Professor Stephen Howes, thank you very much for your insights. Professor Howes there from the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. Thanks.